It is February 5th, 1597, on a wind-swept hill overlooking Nagasaki. The air is filled with the sounds of splintering wood and hammered iron as the crude crosses are raised against a gray winter sky. The cold bites at the exposed skin of the 26 condemned men and boys, a mix of European missionaries and their Japanese flock, forced to walk for nearly a month to arrive at this place of execution. Among them is a 12-year-old boy, Luis Ibaraki. When the guards approach and slice off his left earlobe as a final humiliation, the boy doesn't scream. He laughs. His friend, 14-year-old Thomas Kozaki, dares them to cut his as well. This isn't the quiet submission the authorities wanted. It's a chilling act of defiance that hangs in the frozen air. This brutal public spectacle was meant to be a final warning, a gory full stop on a foreign faith. A petition sent from Japanese Christians to the Pope 7 years later, long buried in an archive in Madrid, speaks of the terror that began this day, a plea for help from the other side of the world that would go unanswered. But this calculated act of state terror was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the planting of a seed in blood-soaked ground. How did the martyrdom of these 26 souls ignite a fire that, just 40 years later, would consume 37,000 lives in the Shimabara rebellion? How does the laughter of a condemned child lead to a field of bones? Most histories offer a simple answer: taxes and oppression. That's the clean, official story, but it's a lie of omission. It conveniently scrubs away the most sinister part of the equation, a deliberate geopolitical move that pitted Western powers against each other, using the lives of Japanese Christians as pawns in a much larger game. The most shocking element isn't the rebellion itself, but who the shogunate recruited to help them crush it. To understand that betrayal, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when the cross was welcomed in Japan, to see how a golden century of faith could curdle into a nightmare. But that brutal end on Nishizaka Hill was an outcome no one could have imagined less than a century earlier, when the first cross touched Japanese soil. To understand the massacre, you have to understand the miracle that preceded it. It all began in 1549 with the arrival of a single man, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier. His landing marked the dawn of what historians would call Japan's Christian century. And for a time, it was a golden age. The faith flourished, spreading with a speed that astonished even the missionaries themselves, taking deep root in the soil of southwestern Japan. At the heart of this explosion of faith was a city, Nagasaki. Before the arrival of the Portuguese, it was a quiet fishing village of just 400 houses. But with the new trade and new faith, it transformed. Picture it, the port buzzing with activity, the tall masts of European galleons dwarfing the local fishing boats, the air thick with the smell of salt, spices, and incense. By 1590, it had swelled to a town of 5,000, and by the early 1600s it was a bustling metropolis of 15,000 people, a vibrant hub for Portuguese commerce and the undeniable center of Catholic life in Japan. For a moment in history, Nagasaki was a window to a different world, a place where East and West met not in conflict but in commerce and conversion. Churches were built, seminaries were established, and a generation of Japanese Christians was born into what seemed like a bright, hopeful future. But this rapid growth, this open embrace of a foreign god and foreign culture, did not go unnoticed. While powerful local lords saw the Portuguese traders and their faith as a gateway to wealth and modern weapons, the rising shogunate in the heart of Japan saw something else entirely. They saw an intrusion, an alternative power base, a threat to be managed, the very things that made this new era feel so promising. The ships, the trade, the ideas were a double-edged sword, and as the century wore on, the shadow of that sword would grow longer and darker until it threatened to sever the connection to the outside world completely. That shadow belonged to one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The great unifier of Japan, a man of immense ambition and deepening paranoia. As he consolidated his power, he looked at the thriving Christian communities in the Southwest and saw not a spiritual movement, but a political one. He saw a network of believers whose ultimate allegiance was to a foreign pope, a network inextricably linked to the military and economic power of Spain and Portugal. In his eyes, the cross was not just a symbol of faith, it was the vanguard of a potential invasion, a threat to the unified Japan he had bled to create. And so, the edict came down. Not as a law to be debated, but as a hammer blow in the dead of winter. The hopeful era of tolerance was over. A sudden, brutal crackdown began, and its first targets were chosen to send a message. In January 1597, on Hideyoshi's direct orders, 26 souls were rounded up in Kyoto. They were a carefully selected cross-section of the faith: 5 Spanish Franciscan missionaries, a Portuguese missionary from India, 3 Japanese Jesuits, and 17 Japanese lay members, ordinary people who had embraced the new religion, including 3 young boys. One moment they were part of a vibrant, thriving community. The next they were prisoners of the state, their crime being their belief. This was not a quiet arrest. It was a public spectacle, the beginning of a methodical campaign of terror. The arrest of these 26 was the first tremor of the earthquake to come, a warning shot fired directly into the heart of the Christian community. But their punishment was not to be a swift execution in the capital. Hideyoshi had a more cruel, more theatrical fate in mind. Their final destination was to be Nagasaki, a city built on their faith. And the journey there would be a long, agonizing performance of state power designed to be witnessed by thousands. That journey was a deliberate, agonizing performance of cruelty, designed to be witnessed by thousands. It began not with a blade, but with a public mutilation. On Friday, January 3, 1597, the 26 prisoners were paraded to a crossroads in Upper Kyoto and forced to their knees. In front of a gathered crowd, a guard with a cold blade went down the line and sliced off the left earlobe of each prisoner, a mark of a common criminal. The act was meant to shatter their spirit, to reduce them to humiliated animals. But something happened that the authorities did not expect. The youngest prisoner, a 12-year-old boy named Luis Ibaraki, looked up at his tormentor and laughed. And beside him, 14-year-old Thomas Kozaki, seeing his friend's defiance, dared the guard to cut his too. It was a moment of shocking, almost insane courage that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. This was not the broken submission Hideyoshi wanted. On January 9th, the real ordeal began. A 27-day forced march in the dead of winter, a brutal trek of nearly 500 miles to Nagasaki. They walked from dawn to sunset each day, barely clothed, their wounds festering in the freezing air. They were paraded through every town and village along the way, a traveling spectacle of state power, a living warning to any who might harbor the same faith. Can you imagine the sheer physical misery? The gnawing hunger, the exhaustion that settles deep in the bones, the raw stumps of their feet on the frozen, muddy roads. Day after day, the destination grew closer. Nagasaki, the name that once meant sanctuary. The heart of their Christian world was now a place of dread. With every painful step, the city was transformed in their minds from a beacon of hope into the stage for their final torment. And now, after 27 days of hell, they see it. The hills surrounding Nagasaki Bay. They have arrived. Their journey is over. But their ordeal is just beginning. The final stage of their ordeal was a short walk to a place now known as Nishizaka Hill. Below them, the city of Nagasaki sprawled out, its harbor and homes a testament to the very faith for which they were about to die. Imagine the horror of that final view, seeing your sanctuary turned into the backdrop for your execution. A crowd had gathered, a sea of silent, watching faces, and waiting for them were 26 crude wooden crosses, laid out in a stark, unforgiving line against the winter sky. On February 5, 1597, the final act of Hideyoshi's warning was carried out. One by one, the prisoners were hoisted onto the crosses. Their bodies were not nailed, but bound and held in place with iron rings around their necks, wrists, and ankles, a method designed to prolong the agony. For hours they hung there, a gallery of suffering for the entire city to see. But the crucifixion itself was not the end. As the afternoon light began to fail, a new set of soldiers approached, each armed with a bamboo lance. In a final, brutal display of state power, they moved down the line and, with practiced efficiency, thrust their spears into the sides of each victim, piercing them through the heart. This was the bloody punctuation mark on Hideyoshi's message. This is what happens to those who follow a foreign god. This is the price of your faith. The state had made its point in the most brutal way imaginable, but they had also done something else, something they hadn't intended. They hadn't just executed 26 people. They had created the first martyrs of Japan. Centuries later, in 1862, Pope Pius IX would officially recognize them as saints, immortalizing their sacrifice. The regime believed this act of ultimate terror would cauterize the wound of Christianity, scaring the faithful into abandoning their beliefs. But what happens when you turn ordinary people and children into revered martyrs? Does it truly extinguish a fire? Or does it simply bury the embers deep underground, where they can smolder for decades, gathering heat, waiting for the right moment to erupt into an inferno? For 40 years, those embers smoldered. The brutal spectacle on Nishizaka Hill was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a new, terrifying normal. The state's campaign to eradicate Christianity became a grinding, oppressive reality, and nowhere was that pressure felt more intensely than in the Shimabara domain, a region where the faith had once been deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. The lands now fell under the rule of a new daimyo, a man named Matsukura Katsui, whose cruelty was matched only by his greed. Under his authority, the people of Shimabara were caught in a vice, squeezed from two directions with unbearable force. First, there was the economic pressure. Matsukura Katsui enforced a series of devastating policies that drastically raised taxes to an impossible level. This wasn't just a hardship, it was a death sentence. Peasants who couldn't pay faced torture and starvation, their crops seized, their families ruined. They were being bled dry to fund their lord's ambitions. At the same time, Matsukura unleashed a ruthless and violent prohibition against Christianity, hunting down believers with a fanatical zeal. The quiet faith that had been practiced for generations was now a capital crime. People were forced to stomp on holy images to prove their apostasy. Those who refused, or were merely suspected of harboring the old beliefs, were subjected to unimaginable torture. They were being stripped not only of their food and their money, but of their very souls. Imagine the desperation. Your body is starving, and your spirit is condemned. You have nothing, and the state demands even that. This combination of economic destitution and religious persecution created a perfect storm of misery. It forged a population that had absolutely nothing left to lose. The Shimabara domain had become a powder keg, packed tight with 40 years of resentment, grief, and righteous fury. It was stable only in its potential for a massive explosion. All it needed now was a single spark. And in the final months of 1637, that spark arrived. It was not a seasoned general or a powerful lord. It was a boy. His name was Amakusa Shiro, a charismatic, almost ethereal youth of just 16. To the desperate and brutalized people of Shimabara and the nearby Amakusa Islands, he was more than just a leader. He was a prophecy fulfilled, a Messiah sent from heaven to deliver them from their suffering. Whispers and poems about him had circulated in secret for years, and now, in their darkest hour, he appeared. And the people, starved of hope for so long, were ready to believe. He became the face of the rebellion, a divine banner around which the oppressed could rally. And they came in their thousands. An unlikely and explosive alliance began to form. The core of the movement was the mostly Catholic peasantry, people who had seen their families starve and their faith outlawed, who had nothing left to lose and a generation of righteous fury to unleash. But they were not alone. They were joined by local ronin, masterless samurai, professional warriors left adrift by the changing times, who brought tactical knowledge and a hardened fighting edge to the rebellion. Under the command of their boy Messiah, this coalition of desperate farmers and disgruntled swordsmen became an army. This was it. The final, desperate stand for their faith, for their lives, for the very memory of their ancestors. They knew the terrifying power of the Tokugawa shogunate. They knew the odds were impossible. But they also knew that a life of quiet submission under Matsukura Katsui was no life at all. It was a choice to fight and die for their God rather than starve under a tyrant. The powder keg had been lit. The uprising had begun. Now all they needed was a fortress, a place to make their final stand against the full might of the empire. That fortress was Hara Castle, a partially ruined stronghold perched on a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by the sea. It was a desperate choice, but a defensible one. The rebels, now an army of tens of thousands of men, women, and children, poured into the crumbling castle, frantically reinforcing its walls, mounting makeshift cannons, and raising banners emblazoned with the cross. This was their final sanctuary, their Jerusalem. But the Tokugawa shogunate, seeing this uprising as an existential threat to its absolute authority, responded with overwhelming force. They didn't send a detachment, they sent an army. A force of over 125,000 professional samurai warriors descended upon the Shimabara Peninsula. A sea of steel and banners sent to crush this rebellion of farmers and ronin. And yet the unthinkable happened. The siege stalled. The shogunate's forces, for all their numbers and training, could not break the fanatical defense of Hara Castle. The rebels, fighting for their families and their God, repelled assault after bloody assault. As the siege dragged on into a stalemate, the shogun's commanders grew desperate, and they turned to a shocking and unexpected ally. Imagine the scene from the castle walls. The rebels, exhausted but defiant, see European ships sailing into the bay. For a fleeting moment, they must have felt a surge of hope. Were these Spanish or Portuguese ships coming to aid their fellow Christians? The hope would have turned to ash in their mouths as the ships revealed their colors. They were Dutch, Protestant traders who saw a cold political calculation. By helping the shogun eliminate their Catholic rivals, they could secure their own exclusive trading rights, and so they agreed to turn their cannons on the Christian rebels. Our primary window into this horrifying betrayal comes from the letters of a Dutch trader stationed right there on the peninsula, a man named Nicholas Quackiebacker, who documented the events for his superiors. It is through his dispassionate accounts that we can confirm the unimaginable. European cannons manned by European crews preparing to bombard a fortress filled with Japanese Christians. The betrayal was now complete. The Biel piece of the shogun's death machine was in place. With the walls of Hara Castle shattered by Dutch cannon fire, the end came swiftly and without mercy. On April 15, 1638, the shogunate's massive army of 125,000 samurai launched their final assault. After months of siege, the rebels were starving, exhausted, and low on ammunition. What followed was not a battle, it was an extermination. The orders were absolute: leave no one alive. The ensuing slaughter was a methodical and total erasure of a people. Samurai poured through the breaches in the walls, cutting down everyone in their path: the ronin warriors, the peasant farmers, the women who had supported them, and their children. Amakusa Shiro, the 16-year-old boy Messiah who had led them, was killed, his head taken as a trophy to be displayed in Nagasaki. When the swords were finally cleaned and the fires burned out, an estimated 37,000 rebels and sympathizers lay dead. The castle and the surrounding lands became a vast, silent graveyard. According to some accounts, only a single person, a painter named Yamada Emosaku, who was later revealed to be a traitor, was spared from the slaughter. The Shimabara rebellion was over. This was the shogunate's final solution to the Christian problem. The event was so traumatic, so utterly devastating, that it effectively annihilated Christianity from public view in Japan for the next 200 years. It was the bloody climax that triggered the final sealing of the country. The shogunate, convinced that foreign influence was a poison, slammed the doors to the outside world, beginning a period of profound national isolation that would last for centuries. The victory seemed complete. Every cross was burned, every church was razed, and every known believer was dead. The land was scoured clean. But can you truly kill a faith with a sword? Or does it simply learn to hide, to whisper its prayers in secret, to go deep underground where no one can find it? The shogunate believed the sword had won, but the sword can only kill the body. It cannot kill a memory. And so, as Japan entered its long, self-imposed isolation, the Christian faith did not die. It simply vanished. It went underground, into a silence that would last for over 200 years. In this age of silence, a new kind of believer was born, the Kakure Kirishitan, the hidden Christians. After the absolute annihilation at Hara Castle, no samurai or official dared to hold the faith, openly or secretly. It was now a religion of the poor and the forgotten, kept alive by farmers and fishermen in the most remote corners of the archipelago, places like the rugged Urakami Valley near Nagasaki and the scattered, isolated Goto and Amakusa Islands. For 7 generations, they lived a double life. Outwardly, they were dutiful Buddhists, registered with their local temple. But secretly, in hidden rooms and remote caves, they preserved the faith of their ancestors. They devised ingenious ways to disguise their devotion. Statues of the Virgin Mary were carved to resemble the Buddhist deity Kannon. Sacred picture scrolls, produced in secret workshops centuries before, were carefully hidden and brought out only for clandestine rituals. Their prayers also went into hiding. Without priests to teach them Latin or Portuguese, the original prayers morphed into something new. They became the orasho, rhythmic chants that mimic the sounds of the old liturgy. The word comes from oratio, the Latin for prayer. But over the centuries, the exact meanings were lost, replaced by a deep generational reverence for the sounds themselves. This was their faith, preserved not in text, but as a sacred, whispered echo. For more than 200 years, this secret world thrived in the shadows, a ghost of Christianity haunting the edges of the shogunate. But how long can a secret of this magnitude be kept? What would happen when the walls of isolation finally began to crumble and the outside world came knocking once again? Those doors to the outside world finally did creak open in the mid-19th century. And as foreigners returned to Japan, they built churches for their own communities, including a new cathedral, or a church, completed in Nagasaki in 1864. In 1865, a French priest named Bernard Petitjean was at that church when a small group of Japanese farmers from the nearby Urakami Valley approached him cautiously. They whispered a question that had been passed down for 7 generations, a question to verify a true priest. Do you honor Santa Maria? In that moment, Petitjean was stunned to realize he was speaking to the living descendants of a faith everyone believed had been extinguished 2 centuries earlier. The secret was out. When religious freedom was finally re-established in 1873, an astonishing 30,000 hidden Christians emerged from the shadows. And in the years since, the echoes from that long silence have only grown louder. In 2018, UNESCO officially recognized the hidden Christian sites in the Nagasaki region as a World Heritage Site, validating their story on a global stage. Archaeologists have uncovered physical proof, like a centuries-old vase with the Spanish word esencia, or fragrant oil, printed on its bottom. A sacred object theory suggests may have once belonged to the Christian feudal lord Konishi Yukinaga himself. As recently as the 1990s, anthropologist Crystal Whelan was able to find and film some of the last true practitioners on the Goto Islands, capturing their rituals and prayers before they vanished forever. But with recognition has come absorption. The very freedom that allowed them to emerge has also meant the end of their unique traditions. On the island of Ikitsuki, their numbers have fallen from 10,000 in the 1940s to less than 100 today. The secret that was so fiercely protected for centuries is now fading into memory. The echoes are growing faint. So what is left when the last of the Orasho chants fade and the final echoes of that long silence disappear into memory? We are left with a story, a chilling and profound testament that stretches far beyond the shores of Japan. It's a story about the collision of cultures, one that began with curiosity and commerce and ended in paranoia and slaughter. It's a raw and brutal lesson in the abuse of power, a demonstration of the terrifying lengths a state will go to enforce absolute control and extinguish what it cannot command. From the theatrical cruelty of Hideyoshi's first martyrdoms to the total annihilation at Hera Castle, we see a portrait of fear and authority that is timeless. But if this story is a testament to the brutality of power, it is an even greater testament to the incredible resilience of human belief. It's in the defiant laughter of a 12-year-old boy facing his tormentors. It's in the hopeless courage of an army of farmers fighting for their God against an empire. And most of all, it's in the quiet, stubborn faith of 7 generations who refused to let their identity be erased, who kept a candle lit through 2 centuries of darkness. This is the enduring legacy. The authorities had the swords, the cannons, and the law. They had the power to burn the books, tear down the churches, and kill the believers. They controlled everything that could be seen and touched. And yet they failed. Because it poses a final, haunting question for any power that seeks to control the human heart. When faith is erased from every book and monument, where does it go? It goes into whispers, into silence, and it waits.